For many centuries now, the big divide within the world of international relations theory has been between realism and liberalism. Now, the consensus view in the West, which most of you are probably familiar with, is the liberal framework. This is the consensus view in the West, and it centres on a belief in democratic peace theory. This is the idea that democratic states are hesitant to go to war with each other, and consequently liberalism seeks the expansion of these states. This is more or less the basic argument inherent in Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man. Almost anyway. But what we're looking at here is that there is another side, which is often ignored, and which I will be discussing today, which is realism. The fascinating thing is that both liberalism and realism are actually two of the oldest schools of thought in international relations theory. But, to my mind, there is now a vast misunderstanding of what realism means, and certainly how people interpret it. So, the consensus view seems to be that liberalism is seen to be inherently good, and realism as somewhat bad. These arguments around geopolitics and war are often premised on looking to hope instead of fear, and so on. And this is the view that has underpinned military action for decades. But behind the appealing ideals there are contradictions, and this video will argue that the West, blinded by noble intentions, is actually helping to push the world towards another mass conflict. This is actually the view taken by the political scientist and international relations scholar John Mearsheimer, who is actually a key figure within the world of offensive realism, and someone whose work I'll be using for this video. Dr. William Ruger also believes the main issue with the US and Western foreign policy with regards to the constant escalation of war is the lack of realism. He believes that geopolitics would be far better served with a realist approach, which also exercises a healthy dose of restraint, rather than the accepted interventionist view which has yielded many conflicts in recent times. But the argument for the realist framework, though pretty benign on the surface, is actually a very difficult argument to make. And not because it doesn't have its merits, but because by arguing for it, you'll also be naturally arguing for an alternative view on a whole array of conflicts. And of course, understandably, war is a very emotive subject. And I will be going over some contemporary conflicts to discuss what I see as the folly of liberalism, and you'll find that this is where things change. To showcase this briefly, let us take a brief look at the overthrow of Assad. So, the narrative, for the sake of brevity, is that he was and is a bad man, therefore it's a good thing that he's gone, and whatever comes next must be better. Now, if that is your view, I'm not here to say you're wrong, only to say that a realist, whether they agree with the sentiment or not, would not believe that such a statement justifies the action. Moral justification aside, a realist wouldn't accept the premise that Syria, like that of Iran, is an enemy to the US because of human rights abuses or domestic leadership. A casual glance at diplomacy kind of bears this out. Syria and Iran are pariah states to the West, and Syria has even had a significant portion of its territory occupied by the US for a long period of time. But on the other hand, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are staunch allies to the West. And it's also worth acknowledging that the West has been known to change sides too, often arming insurgencies or sometimes whole countries, only to invade them later. And the former CIA intel analyst Larry C. Johnson has argued that the Anglo-American involvement in Syria is, in his view, an extension of the Ukraine war, and that what happens in Syria is not actually about Syria or even Assad's domestic rule, but in his view because Assad wasn't doing the West bidding. So therefore the conflict in his mind is more akin to how Syria can actually be used geopolitically. Now, if that seems a bit off, it's probably worth noting that Assad's fall did come at the confluence of 3 other wars. Israel and Hezbollah, Turkey's war with the Kurds, and America's war on ISIS. And after the overthrow of Assad, Syria was left in a very complicated situation. Insurgents led by Ahmed al-Sharaa were consequently talked of somewhat fondly in Western circles, despite him once having a 10 million bounty on his head, and despite having been a member of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and actually helped form the Al-Nusra Front. Realists like John Mearsheimer and Larry C. Johnson look at this and conclude that the conflict in Syria and the removal of Assad is therefore likely part of a larger power struggle. A good earlier example came in 1953 when the US, worried about the pro-Soviet Iranian government, engineered Operation Ajax in cooperation with MI6 and the CIA, ultimately overthrowing the Iranian government and installing the Shah as the new autocratic leader of Iran. And having overthrown the Iranian government, the US then becomes the dominant foreign power in Iran. And 1979 proved that trying to tell a nation how to behave rarely works in the modern world. Conducting social engineering at the end of a rifle is a prescription for giant trouble, civil war, and insurgencies. The point is, there will be resistance. Resistance in the case of Iran that is still very much there today. But the liberal framework still dominates Western foreign policy, and it is this view which is alienating more powerful countries like Russia and China. Now, it is important to emphasise that there are varying facets to both liberalism and realism, and you certainly don't need to take the either-or approach. But generally speaking, in the words of William Ruger, the realist view stems from an understanding of the world as it is, and not how we would idealistically like it to be. And this means acknowledging several basic facts about the world and the constraints in the international system. It also means recognising that fundamentally power matters, and that states will compete for it, and as a consequence this competition can lead to war. Realism also acknowledges that the world is in essence characterised by anarchy, so think of billiard balls on a pool table. The competition is constant. It's probably worth noting that anarchy, and the belief in it, means only that there is no hierarchy above the state. This is the natural order. So as long as this is the case, states will seek cooperation for power, and conflict is a consequence of a power struggle. And when we in the West tend to think of conflict, like that of a film, we judge the war as a good versus evil endeavour. A survivor of the Vietnam War, Tim O'Brien, once wrote, "If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from a larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie." As William Randolph Hearst famously quipped, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Power and control is vital in the public perception of war, as Jonathan Powell and Alistair Campbell admitted. So opposing a consensus is difficult. And given this is the case, this is where things get really interesting, because I want to examine some real-world examples in a bit more detail, not from the liberalist perspective, but from that of realism. And the two I want to take a look at are first Russia and then China. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. Okay, so just a disclaimer up front. I support Ukrainian and Russian nationalism. So this very sober and honest analysis only aims to understand the geopolitics that created the conditions for war in the first place. From the realist perspective, of course. War starts when diplomacy fails, and this war will need some form of diplomacy to end. In respect of Ukraine, it's been attacked, and if a nation is attacked, its instinct is to fight back. So I'm not here to talk ill of Ukraine. So with that being said, for a realist, the main cause of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is actually NATO expansion. But for that to make sense, I'm going to give a bit of context first. Vladimir Putin's time in office seen dramatic improvements for Russia from the lawless 1990s. And while he may not have wanted to ally with Western interests, he did nonetheless initially seek friendship with the West. And in this regard, discussions regarding Russia's place in both NATO and even the EU took place at one stage, with the former General Secretary to NATO, George Robertson, since confirming that Putin was sincere about NATO membership. Putin also told the BBC reporter, David Frost, that NATO membership could not be ruled out. Russia, he stated, was part of European culture, and he did not want it to turn away from what he and Russia seen as the civilized world. But of course, as many of us know, the Kremlin's view would sharply change in the years ahead. And Putin's rationale regarding that change that led to the 22 invasion has been outlined in various places. A 2021 essay, a TV address at the time of the invasion, and an interview he conducted with Tucker Carlson. And from this, the central and real issue that Putin speaks of is NATO expansion. In his interview with Tucker Carlson, he goes on to recount politicians such as Germany's Egon Bahr, who advised against NATO expansion and talks of the guarantees that Russia was promised, namely, and very famously, not 1 inch to the east, only for Russia to be met with 5 waves of expansion, bringing NATO to Russia's doorstep. NATO's ideological aggression, coupled with its expansion, was not just a concern for Russia. It had actually been a concern for many involved within it. George Cannon described NATO expansion as a mistake, as did Paul Nitze, and William Perry, Bill Clinton's Secretary to Defense, was so worried about NATO expansion and its lack of regard for the security concerns of others that he considered resigning over it. These individuals, while supportive of the organisation, were concerned at its lack of regard for the security concerns of others. It's also important to remember that at one stage, Russia too didn't fear NATO. But by 2007, with several waves of expansion, that had changed. And Putin would very famously make this displeasure known at a Munich speech in 2007.
Unilateral, often illegitimate actions have not solved a single problem. Moreover, they have become a generator of new human tragedies and hotbeds of tension. Judge for yourself. There are no fewer wars. The United States has crossed its national borders in all areas, in the economy, in politics, and in the humanitarian sphere. And this is being imposed other states. Well, who will like it? Who will like it?
Despite this rift, NATO expansion continued, and the following year, NATO declared that Georgia and Ukraine would both join NATO. And it's here where there is somewhat of a split in NATO, because the US wants to push forward with NATO expansion, but Sarkozy in France and Angela Merkel in Germany are nervous about it, and they actually block the plan, knowing how such a move will be seen to Russia. NATO itself was fostering uprisings, it was toppling leaders and invading nations, and it was also clear NATO did seek regime change in Russia. And listening to Putin's TV address, he states that NATO having ballistic missiles on the Russian border is akin to having a knife against the country's throat. On the 17th of December 2021, so 2 months prior to the invasion, Putin did actually write a letter to the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, and a letter to the US President, Joe Biden, seeking a solution to the crisis. To this end, John Mearsheimer has talked extensively on how little interest the West had in resolving the Russia-Ukraine issue diplomatically, even at this critical point, up until the last 48 hours at least. The London School of Economics have actually argued that a Russian attack on Ukraine was actually desired by NATO. It is true that NATO does want regime change in Russia, and is not an organisation that is adverse to conflict to achieve such goals. NATO can't attack Russia, as they have with other nations, Therefore, it has been argued that Ukraine is being used as a battering ram via the US war machine to undermine Russia. Russia's unease at NATO expansion leading up to the war was also exacerbated by events within Ukraine itself. Because tied to NATO expansion, there was also a messy civil conflict going on in Ukraine, roughly speaking between those that supported close cooperation with Russia and those that saw closer ties with the West. At the time this was all going on, the then Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych was aware of the precarious situation and as a result rejected EU trade talks and instead proposed three-way talks between Ukraine, the EU and also Russia. This he argued would be a better way to proceed given the conditions of the time. But ultimately the EU rejected trilateral talks and told Yanukovych he must sign the agreement, which actually excluded Russia, and that's something Yanukovych actually refused to do, and consequently he was overthrown and forced to flee to Russia. And a leaked phone call did soon emerge on the 4th of February 2014 in which the US diplomat Victoria Nuland is actually heard talking about who should be installed as the new Ukrainian Prime Minister, directly to the ambassador to Ukraine. Now it's this that prompts Putin to annex the Crimea, and that's a decision that prompts outrage from the West. From the Russian perspective, however, Putin commented to Tucker Carlson that such a decision was necessary, given the West had just toppled a leader in his view, and therefore, given the conditions of the time, and the fact that Crimea had elected a separatist parliament, not annexing it, given the conditions, would have been, in his words, culpable negligence. The civil war sadly continued, however, and consequently there were attempts to quell the conflicts going on within Ukraine, which did actually involve the West, and the most well known being the Minsk agreements. These talks did go ahead, but became somewhat tainted when three of the leaders involved in the talks, all of the leaders in fact apart from Russia, went on record to state that the negotiations themselves were not for peace in the main, but merely as a means to buy time and to build upon forces. And when this is leaked, Putin responds by saying, "Now there is a question of trust. It is already almost at zero. I have said many times we are ready for agreements, we are open. This makes us think about who we are dealing with." But ultimately in this situation, both sides did have their own security concerns and the talks break down. The civil conflict continues in Ukraine, and so did talks about NATO expansion. But this expansion and interference continues to be an issue for Russia. From a Western perspective, however, much of this falls on deaf ears, as it appears Ukraine is looking towards the West. So if Ukraine wishes to join NATO, then it is their right as a sovereign nation to join NATO. A good argument in principle. The issue here is that Ukraine previously actually had a positive relationship with Russia, electing a leader that actually sought neutrality. And Ukraine only moved sharply towards NATO in 2014 after Russia invaded. And this only happened following the toppling of Yanukovych. Subsequently, the pro-West uprisings came, but something often omitted is so did that of the pro-Russian uprisings. These divides cross political lines and regions and involve millions of people, and tragically thousands of deaths. Realists argued for many years prior to the 2022 invasion for the West to stop fostering such a conflict, knowing what the result could be. And this is by no means speculative. In an interview with Tucker Carlson, Glenn Greenwood talks of the millions of dollars spent by the US government on opposition groups, not just in Ukraine, but to Vladimir Putin himself in Russia. And this isn't supposed interference he's referring to. The US government was openly funding groups to destabilise Russia at the time, and one only needs to imagine what such action would look like if the countries were reversed. Now, the other point, of course, is Ukrainian sovereignty, and this is where the West really do have the upper hand in many regards, because in an ideal world, all nations, be they big or small, would have autonomy. But sadly, this isn't the natural order today. And going back to where we started, it is important to see the world as it is, rather than how we would like it to be. Because Russia itself isn't actually behaving any differently than the US or Britain would in a similar situation. And to illustrate this point somewhat, let's just imagine that Mexico, or indeed any other country in the Western Hemisphere, decided, as a sovereign nation, in charge of their own destiny, to join a military alliance with China. Would the US accept it? The Monroe Doctrine is pretty emphatic, to the point that it really doesn't need to be argued. We all know in this situation the West would not be talking about the sovereign rights of Mexico or any other state. They would be talking about their security concerns, just as Russia is at the moment. And just as the US formally did when Cuba decided to ally with the Soviets. At that time, the US didn't worry about Cuba's sovereign rights or autonomous rights. They invaded the country because they were worried about their security. This is the reason liberal hegemony was able to work pretty well back in the 1990s. And that's because we were in a unipolar world, a world with just one superpower, and certainly no near competitor. Realists in general don't believe liberal hegemony can operate in a multipolar world, and given the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power, we are now back to that world. And as a consequence, security competition is also back. Realism itself seeks to recognise these security concerns as a means to mediate conflict. And as John Mearsheimer notes, this is not an ideal situation, but international politics is all about choosing among bad alternatives. And in his view, if realism had been embraced and the West had not pushed NATO upon Ukraine, then Ukraine would still be intact today. But he does accept that this is a hard sell, and people don't want to believe this, because that would mean we in the West bear some responsibility. But in his view, our leadership does bear a portion of responsibility in pursuing a reckless foreign policy, which, had it been pushed upon ourselves, we wouldn't have accepted either. And just for the record, John Mearsheimer isn't simply being pro-Russia, as many like to think. And I want to give some credence to this, as I'm sure many of you have your doubts. So, in 1993, when Ukraine still actually retained their nuclear capability, it was actually him who was one of very few voices that argued that Ukraine would be best to retain their nuclear weapons, and not to hand them over to Russia. However, the consensus at that time was for Ukraine to indeed hand their weapons over to Russia, and after Ukraine was pressured by the West, that's what they did. And that's something that Bill Clinton has gone on to express much regret over. Realism, however, understandably acknowledged that Ukraine, free of nuclear weapons, could potentially be used as a battering ram to fight a proxy war to weaken Russia. And one only has to look at the countless number of proxy wars that killed millions of people during the Cold War. And very quickly you'll see that power and ideology override morality, even if morality is how wars are sold en masse. To this end, John Mearsheimer has argued that the West has now framed Putin as an imperialist, eager to conquer territory, which is something he doesn't believe is true. So, despite this being pushed, in Jeffrey Sachs' words,
Russia, by the way, despite every single thing that's said every single day, truly, really does not want more land. It's already 11 time zones. The last thing that they need or want is more land. The war is about completely different things than everything you and I read about in our newspapers every day, because our newspapers are telling us stories that ultimately come back to narratives conceived in the US Defense Department and the CIA, and that are completely bogus.
So, with that, let's take a look at the moment of the invasion itself. And here we find that the West is split on how to respond initially. And with this, it's certainly worth acknowledging the very spirited defence Ukraine actually put up, and the fact that Russia was initially slow to react, meaning there were some in NATO who might have believed it was possible to win the war militarily. But this, however, doesn't last long, because then Russia mobilises. And that's not just in manpower, but also in tanks and aircraft. and so the war becomes static, and in a war of attrition, two factors matter. The population size of the country, because that tells you how many soldiers you can actually send to the front, and artillery. Generally speaking, these are what decides who can win in a war of attrition, and in both cases, Ukraine are at a significant disadvantage. And I do find it difficult to believe that this wasn't obvious in the West. Now, as this is all unfolding, however, many in the West did favour some semblance of peace talks. And one of these, rather surprisingly in my view, was Olaf Scholz, who advised the former British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, that if there was to be another war on the continent, perhaps it would be better to contain it and to make sure that such a conflict was over as soon as possible, with the minimum loss of life. Now, it is true in the weeks after the invasion, in March 2022, that peace talks did indeed commence, as it was widely known that such a conflict would only be able to end with some form of negotiation. And as a result, Putin and Zelensky begin negotiating an end to the war. And at this time, the negotiations were taking place in Istanbul and involved Turkey and Israel's then Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who actually mediated the talks directly. And Bennett has since gone on to explain how close these talks were to coming to an agreement. The negotiation group leader, who still has the presidential faction in the country's parliament, put his preliminary signature on the document, stating publicly he was ready to agree to a formal peace. However, it was at this moment the UK Prime Minister weighed in and actually implored Ukraine to fight, and a decree was subsequently issued prohibiting Ukraine from negotiating with Russia. So the West chose not to settle a war, and as such Zelensky walked away from negotiations. Negotiations that would ultimately be needed at some point during the conflict. And the West would go on to double down on this approach, criminalising Russian media and escalating the conflict. And peace talks were looked at with fear and not hope, and the constant call was to escalate the conflict and for it to go on. An example of this would be Storm Shadow missiles being used to attack Russia proper, thus bringing the West within an inch of nuclear war, and a mere 1% of Ukrainians actually believe in a Ukrainian victory. Most accept that negotiations will be needed. So to look at peace talks with fear and call for the war to continue from a realist perspective is wrong. And these lessons will be important for how the West deals with China in the future. So, before I wrap things up, I want to take a brief look at China and the similarities geopolitically which are at play. Because with China we find a pretty similar situation. US presidents have said they'll go to war for Taiwan, and China on the other hand has said reunification with Taiwan is inevitable. So already we can see the similarities, and for this to make sense I do just want to give a bit of context, as I did with Ukraine, to better understand where we are at the moment. After the Second World War, the US occupied the Pacific, and they established naval bases and subsequently surrounded China. At the time, China was an impoverished nation, so it was left with little choice but to accept this as a reality. But China has since become very powerful, and it still lays claim to much of this territory that the US still occupies. So while to the West and the liberal framework, China choosing to militarise islands in the South China Sea might seem aggressive and certainly defies international law, to a realist, whether this is desirable or not, the action is perfectly predictable. And not because China is being aggressive, but because it is powerful. Why should we expect China to behave any differently to that of the West? If China acquiring dominance in the seas is seen as aggressive, then why is it not aggressive for the West to seek dominance in their seas also? China has, and will ultimately continue to follow the same basic realist logic, and in doing so attempt to become a regional hegemon in Asia. And what this actually means is, like the US and like Russia, China will prefer smaller neighbours. Ironically, it's the West that actually facilitated China's growth in exchange for cheaper imports that are now being hostile to China. And the fallout is, if China is told its actions defy international agreements, then it would be logical to expect them to shift to establishing their own order. This isn't a small nation such as Libya or Vietnam. It's a major and growing power in the world today. And I'd argue they've already started to do that actually. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit is a pretty good example of this. And should China, despite its economic problems, and it certainly does have them, continue its economic growth over the coming decades, it will attempt to secure its dominance in Asia in much the same way that the US secures its own dominance within the Western Hemisphere. The problem here is that the United States and the doctrine of liberalism does not tolerate peer competitors. This is why, in time, they will go to great lengths to prevent China establishing dominance within Asia. And a key component in this struggle will be Taiwan. The Taiwan issue is perhaps the most contentious, and has been brewing for some time. Back in the 1970s, when Richard Nixon wanted to create a dialogue between the US and China, he actually seen Taiwan as the main obstacle to diplomatic relations, and as a result he promised to withdraw US troops from the island, stating that the US would acknowledge that Taiwan was part of China. The key word here, of course, is the word acknowledge, a word which is ambiguous at best, and in short it appears that both sides at the time sought to mediate the issue. China had their view, and the US had theirs. Later on, the US President Jimmy Carter actually opened up official diplomatic relations with China, further removing the United States' ties towards Taiwan. US and Taiwan flags were lowered as the Mutual Defense Treaty was brought to a close. Congress, however, did pass the Taiwan Relations Act, with Senator Jacob Javits stating that the act is not a pledge to go to war over Taiwan, but it is a pledge to regard any effort to subdue Taiwan by force, direct or indirect, as a matter of very grave concern to our country. This act is still US law today, and it is the basis for US and Taiwan relations. In respect of Taiwan, the Chinese president has stated no one can disrupt the historical trend towards unification of the motherland. And the West, on the other hand, just seems more ready for war, with Jeffrey Sachs outlining the US Navy's readiness at Cambridge.
The Navy just issued a plan about 3 weeks ago. It says we have to prepare for war with China by 2027. Doesn't say we'll have a war with China. It says we have to prepare for war with China by 2027. We are not playing a video game. They're playing with your futures. China's not threatening anybody abroad, anybody.
Sachs goes on to explain that China's actions are actually a reaction to US policy which is overtly attempting to block China's sea lanes. And if the West wasn't taking such action, then these tensions would subside. And he also takes a very firm view on where the US should put their naval bases.
You don't have your right to put your military bases anywhere you want and expect peace in this world. You have to have some prudence. There's no such thing as an open door that we're going to be there and we're going to put our missile systems there and that's our right. There's no right to that.
China is now a powerful nation, and they don't want US military bases in their seas. So while on one hand we are told that China is assembling a massive military presence in these seas, and they certainly are by the way, from a realist approach, escalation only leads to one thing. Because what China is doing with regards to military presence is something the West has been doing for decades anyway in those very same waters. China is simply, rightly or wrongly, behaving just as the US does in the Western Hemisphere. The only difference between today and the 1990s is that they are powerful. And this is something China will continue to do in accordance with the doctrine of realism. So in this regard, the West can either be diplomatic and accept China as a power, and accept that like the West they will seek to dominate their region, or they can escalate the tensions. But these are realistically the only options, in a general sense anyway. And given China isn't a country that seeks war, escalating these tensions does seem unwise. The Taiwan issue, therefore, is best solved diplomatically between China and Taiwan. And I don't think there's many people who honestly believe the West would go to war over Taiwan anyway. And in John Mearsheimer's words, once again, international politics is all about choosing among bad alternatives. So, offensive realism is certainly a hard sell in the West, and it really goes against the grain of what people are used to. One aspect of this is actually the way we look at war in the West, in that we tend to glorify conflict and simplify war to a good versus evil spectacle. So no matter how devastating a war is, the narrative, like that of a film, actually can overpower the tragedy. With regards to the conflict in Ukraine, TLDR News has outlined just how in favour the UK is in continuing the war. And unlike the rest of Europe, the UK even supports sending troops to Ukraine. The UK army would only last a few days in armed conflict anyway, but the constant call, nevertheless, and held in good faith by millions, is to stand with Ukraine.
Just everybody understand, what does it mean to stand with Ukraine like Boris Johnson stands with Ukraine? It means 2,000 Ukrainians killed or wounded severely every single day. That's not standing with Ukraine. That is standing with the destruction of Ukraine. It's exactly the opposite.
A soldier will always fight for what they know, in the country where they live, because of the information they receive. It certainly is no accident that millions of soldiers just happen to fight for the land in which they live. And with Ukraine, the double standards are clear. The West did play a crucial role in toppling a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine, and they also helped foster a conflict that completely destroyed the previous positive Ukraine and Russia relationship, killing thousands. And US diplomats were found to be discussing the new leader of Ukraine, and consequently there is a push to put NATO missiles next to Russia, by the very people that want regime change in Russia. Russia, of course, ultimately invades, and Ukraine fights valiantly for their nation, as one would expect.
Будем защищаться. Не наступать, защищаться.
And when both sides sought peace, the West kept the war going, without a plan of how it would be won. This, by the way, is not a justification for the invasion. It's just I haven't found a major power in the West, today or in the past, that would actually tolerate what Russia has. The idea that Russia would attack NATO is certainly not true, and most leaders know this. And this idea that every nation, big or small, has autonomy is certainly a nice notion, and one, at least in principle, I absolutely support. But this isn't, and never has been sadly, the case. And the very people wanting to continue the war in Ukraine, in the name of democracy, often contradict their own morals.
They don't care at all about democracy, by the way, at all. They topple governments they don't like, that won't do their bidding. They topple democracies if they don't like them. They'll topple anybody that they don't like. That's how it's worked all along. They never said, oh, we can't topple Mossadegh in 1953. He's a democratic government. No, they toppled a democratic government in Iran and put in a police state.
The US, let's not forget, has around 750 military bases in at least 80 countries and troops in around 150 countries. And it uses its leverage along with sanctions, money and military to effect change. The military-industrial complex increases the likelihood of war, and the West has meddled in countless elections around the world, toppled leaders, and quite often behaves with impunity. By the way, this is not a personal critique of the US, or any other state by the way. It's just a critique of geopolitics. Liberal hegemony at its core is a very radical form of foreign policy, and can only really exist in a world where there is one major power. Today, however, there is more than one great power, So, as I outlined earlier, security competition is back. And this is something the West has struggled to deal with. Realism itself, offensive or defensive, seeks solutions that mediate the power balance. This means preserving US power and influence, but respecting that there are other spheres of influence in the world. And while liberal hegemony is still certainly the order of the day, I would argue that the more it declines in prominence, and the more that realism is embraced in the West, the more likely that peace is. So yeah, that's a pretty bold statement, so I'll leave this here for now. I hope you got something out of it. Bye for now. Take care.